This is an RNZ podcast.
Watching from a distance is going to be really nerve-wracking because we don't know what'll happen and some things might go wrong. And for me, as making the Kākāpō Files, it does mean I think Season 2 will have a very different vibe to Season 1.
Kia ora, nau mai hara mai ki te ao hurahanga, ko Clark and Cannon tēnei. Later, we'll do a bit of a recap of the year in New Zealand science with some of the team from the Science Media Centre. But first, that voice, which you may well be familiar with, Alison Ballance, radio legend and former Our Changing World producer and presenter. 6 years ago, for almost 10 months, Alison reported on the roller coaster ride that was the 2019 Kākāpō breeding season in a podcast called The Kākāpō Files. Now she returns with a second season.
Kia ora, Claire. It's so lovely to be back talking and thinking and breathing Kākāpō again.
Yes, let's do it. And let's just start with a Kākāpō 101. Give me the introduction. What is a Kākāpō?
For a start, it's the world's largest parrot, and you might ask, how big is big? Well, anything from 1.5 to 4 kilos, that's quite an armful of bird.
Yeah, they're quite chunky looking. They're pretty roundy and flightless, right?
Yep, the only flightless parrot out there as well.
But great climbers, excellent climbers.
They can climb like there's no tomorrow. They sometimes jump out of a tree thinking mistakenly that they can fly, but they have the flying ability of a brick. But climbing, they are fabulous.
Right, and that's how they get around and also get the snacks, because these parrots are vegetarian?
Yep, berries and leaves are on the menu. Lots of different kinds of berries and leaves.
And we are making such a big deal about their breeding because these birds don't breed every year. There's a lot of different really interesting things about Kākāpō breeding. Can you give us a few of the highlights?
The one thing that you need to know about Kākāpō is you have to be very, very patient if you're going to be following Kākāpō, because they only breed every 2 to 4 years. And the last time they bred was 4 years ago. And I can say then that the population reached a high of 252 birds, which was amazing.
That was the 21-22 season. There was 57 chicks fledged. So that was the population high at the time. As you say, 4 years ago, numbers have dwindled a bit since. And now we're coming into this new season with about 237 birds. Is that right?
Last I heard it was 237 birds, and hopefully it's still the same.
And they are lek breeders.
Yeah, it's an unusual breeding system. The males display and compete to attract the females. In the case of Kākāpō, they spend all night, every night for months on end booming, this deep, resonant booming sound that carries through the forest. And then they have another sound, a higher sound called a ching. They do that and the females go, oh, I like the sound of that. And then they decide which male they're going to mate with.
Do they have to kind of build an attractive area as well? Do I have that right?
That's exactly right. They build what we call a track and bowl system. So they're effectively just tidying up a patch in the bush. They make tracks, which are like little pathways leading towards 1, 2, sometimes 3 bowls, which are just depressions scooped out of the ground. And when the male is booming, he sits in one of these depressions, and that's the focal point of his display area.
These Kākāpō, today, Alison, we find them on offshore predator-free islands off the South Island. Now, there are a few that are scattered in other places. They once would have been widespread, though, right?
Well, I've heard numbers saying they were the 3rd or 4th most common bird throughout New Zealand. So they were everywhere. They were in big numbers.
Yeah, but now confined to Waiponamu mostly, where they're taonga to Ngaitahu.
Yep, the iwi Ngaitahu, they are definitely a taonga species to them. And we have to remember too that they are very endangered. So on the threat classification ranking that they have here in New Zealand, they are threatened, nationally critical. So they went from being one of the most common birds to one of our most endangered.
You know, I've said you're known for the Kākāpō Files, this amazing series that was on RNZ. But your involvement with Kākāpō actually started long before that, right?
My involvement with Kākāpō goes back to 1995, and that was a real high point for me in my just life journey really, getting involved with Kākāpō. But that point in time was a real low point for the Kākāpō population. So at that time there were just 51 known birds. There were 21 females, 30 males. And the other significance of 1995 is that it marks the beginning of the Kākāpō recovery program that the Department of Conservation runs in its current form. So there had been some conservation work done before, but the program as it currently runs also kicked off in 1995. And you need to remember that in the 10 years running up to 1995, there had only been 3 Kākāpō chicks that survived to adulthood.
Wow.
There was Dobby and Stumpy and Hoki. And then, as we've already mentioned, you fast forward 30 years, and now we have 237 living Kākāpō.
Yeah. I mean, that's, as you say, it's been a big journey, a lot of effort on behalf of the Kākāpō Recovery Program and Ngāi Tahu. But you name-checked birds there. So every Kākāpō has a name?
It does, and it's wonderful. It's following in that great tradition of the late Jane Goodall, for example, who gave all her chimps names. And every name tells a story, so it really helps you understand that individual bird and its life and its family. And I began collecting the names back in 1995, and it's now an A to Z of all known Kākāpō, actually going back to 1955.
It was one of the things I think that stood out for me in the Kākāpō Files first series was that we really got to know not just the human characters, but these Kākāpō characters as well. But is it really A to Z?
Yeah, it's a complete alphabet soup. I did go through and add it up the other day, and I've got 360 names. And there's also another 15 birds that we knew of in Fiordland that never got named. So basically, since 1955, we've known of 375 Kākāpō.
Wow, right. Okay, well, tell me then about Kākāpō Z. Who's Kākāpō Z? What's their story?
That's Zephyr. That is a very fine choice. She has a really interesting story. So she was found in 1981 on Rakiura, Stewart Island, when she was just a chick. And to put that in context, the Rakiura population had only been discovered just 4 years earlier.
Wow.
Before that, we only knew of a few old males in Fiordland. And Zephyr's mum is Nora, and Nora was only the second female ever found on Rakiura. And in 1981, her nest, which had 2 chicks in it, Zephyr and Adler, who got named after the dog that found them, that was the first nest seen both since the rediscovery on Rakiura 4 years earlier and actually since the beginning of the 20th century. So a hugely significant nest.
Yeah, that's wild. But what happened next for Zephyr and Adler?
Well, sadly, Adler disappeared. He was probably eaten by a feral cat, and that was an increasingly common story at that time in the early 80s on Rakiura. And in fact, it got to the stage that the feral cat problem was so bad that what was then the Wildlife Service made a decision to move every Kākāpō they could catch to a safe island. And it was a world first. Nowhere else in the world have we moved an entire wild species to new locations. So Zephyr and Nora were caught and they were moved to Whenua Hou, Codfish Island, which is just off Stewart Island. And that had just become free of weka and possums. And birds were also being taken to Hauturu, Little Barrier Island in the Hauraki Gulf, and that had just been made free of feral cats. So just in the nick of time, there were some safe islands to take them to.
And as you say, world first, that really radical decision to relocate these wild birds to these safer spaces, which is where breeding still happens today, right? Is Whenua Hou is one of the breeding islands still. And
that's Kākāpō Central.
Yeah. And did Zephyr go on to breed on Whenua Hou?
She certainly did. So 1992, when she was 11, was the first time she bred, and she produced 3 chicks. And it was a rimu mast year, and we'll be learning more about that as the Kākāpō Files go along. So basically a mass fruiting of the rimu trees, except the rimu didn't ripen, and it was a disaster.
So what happened to her chicks then?
By the time the rangers on the island found Zephyr's nest, one of her chicks was already dead from starvation. They rescued the other 2. They managed to rescue one other chick from another nest. They took all 3 to Auckland Zoo. 1 chick survived, and that was Hoki. She was the first ever hand-reared Kākāpō.
what was next for Zephyr? Did she go on to breed again?
She did. She's actually been quite a good wee breeder. So 1997 was her next opportunity. So Zephyr had 2 chicks. And at that stage, I was making wildlife documentaries and I was filming at her nest. She had 2 sons. One was TY, and another one who went on to become really well known was Sirocco, who became the spokesbird for conservation.
So is Sirocco's mum, Zephyr, still alive?
Zephyr is still alive and she'll be turning 45 in a couple of months. And she has 10 chicks that have fledged and she's a grandmother.
Right, amazing. And word on the street, Alison, is that 2026 is going to be a very big breeding season. Do we know exactly how big?
Potentially huge. It's by far and away the biggest remu fruiting season on record.
Okay, so excitement levels are high. Obviously, the remu mast is a very important part of this. The other really important part of this is how many female Kākāpō there are. So there was a point 30 years ago, we'd had just 21 female Kākāpō. How many females of breeding age do we have now coming into this big 2026 breeding season?
Okay, drum roll. 4 times that. We have 84 adult females.
Wow. Okay.
And they are spread across 3 breeding islands. So some are on Whenua, Codfish Island, others are on Pukenui, Anchor Island, in Dusky Sound and Fiordland, and the remainder are on Te Kākahu or Chalky Island, which is also in southern Fiordland.
Right, so 3 breeding islands now. In the first series of the Kākāpō Files, there was a lot of episodes that talked about the intensive management that was going underway. So there were people who were removing eggs from females to encourage double clutching, which is where the females have a second go, right? They lay more eggs, so you're kind of boosting the amount of Kākāpō you might get in that season. There were eggs that were artificially incubated. There was lots of hand rearing and fostering. There was supplementary feeding. Will we be seeing this again this season across those 3 islands?
We'll see a bit of that, especially on Whenua. So they are going to do artificial insemination again because there are some birds that they really want to get more offspring from. They will have supplementary feeding on Whenua to support the females. But overall, DOC's really trying to pull back. I consider it, they're trying to do themselves out of a job, really. And so in the last 30 years, it's been important to increase numbers as quickly as possible. But you can't keep up this intensity of effort for this many birds. So this season is about leaving birds, especially on Te Kākahu, on Chalky, and Pukenui, Anchor Island, to their own devices. And having said that, the Kākāpō recovery team will still be using technology to keep a remote eye on the nesting mums. So if it's absolutely necessary, they could step in. But from a storytelling point of view, watching from a distance, it's going to be really nerve-wracking because we don't know what will happen and some things might go wrong. And for me, as making the Kākāpō Files, it does mean I think Season 2 will have a very different vibe to Season 1.
And you're working with DOC's Kākāpō recovery team for Kākāpō Files Series 2. I know you've already been chatting to some of the people who are there on the ground or getting ready to go down. So what's the news from these islands so far?
So for the last couple of months, the boys have been doing lots of housework, which is always good to hear. So the male Kākāpō have been tidying up their track and bowl systems. And the first male who was heard booming this year was Faulkner in late November. So Faulkner is 9 years old, coming on 10, and so this will be his first booming season. And over the weeks that have followed, lots of other males have joined in now. So if you went to Whenua and went to the top of the island at night, you would hear multiple Kākāpō booming. And can I just point out that Faulkner seems to have inherited the early gene from his mum Pearl, because she's usually the earliest female to mate. And the Kākāpō team say they wouldn't be surprised if she mates at Christmas again this year, although they suspect that most of the mating action will kick off a week or 2 after that, so closer to the new year.
Right, but that's coming up quick, and you'll be keeping us up to date with all the action via the Kākāpō Files.
I sure will. So Doc's Kākāpō recovery team will be sharing all the latest news with us as this boomer bumper breeding season gets underway, fingers crossed. And I'll be doing all sorts of other things as well. I'll be shining a spotlight on science. I'll be sharing the life and times of some notable individual kākāpō. There'll be no shortage of things to listen to.
That, of course, was the legendary Alison Ballance. Thank you, Alison. To keep up to date with the Kākāpō Files, find and follow the podcast on your favourite app, where new episodes will show up as soon as news comes in from the breeding islands. Or you can find it on the RNZ podcast page, or you can listen on RNZ National on summer mornings, Tuesdays, 11:45. Now we catch up with Daisha Herbulock and Daniel Walker of the Science Media Centre. The Science Media Centre is a publicly funded organisation hosted by the Royal Society in Wellington that supports journalists covering science topics. Daisha is the centre's director, and we start by discussing the busy year that's been with regards reform in the New Zealand science sector.
There's been several years of signalling that lots of changes are coming. This year in 2025, we started to get some of the clear picture of what the roadmap is ahead. Started out with a big announcement in January this year that we're going to see 3 new public research organizations created out of the existing Crown Research Institutes. So we have one that's focused on the bioeconomy, and we've got one on earth sciences as the main focus, and another that's looking at health and forensic sciences, with a 4th, which is the Advanced Technology Institute, that's being created brand new.
Right, and this new Advanced Technology Research Organisation, what is it going to be looking at?
What's been signaled so far is there'll be a focus on advanced materials, biotech, and also perhaps quantum technologies, but artificial intelligence is one that has definitely been confirmed as one of its platforms. So essentially they've told us it will focus as a hub and spoke model, and that there'll be sort of centralized administration that's happening in Auckland, and then different areas where the research is actually happening around the country. A lot of this detail, though, is still to be announced. It's still being shaped up, and we'll know more in 2026.
So those new public research organizations, they kicked off in July. They're kind of still in the getting together phase. That's my understanding. Does that feel about right to you?
This year has definitely been a year where we've seen a lot of momentum. So the former Crown Research Institutes, they knew this was coming, and they have worked really fast to try to support the merger of their organizations into these new public research orgs. And so from 1 July, those entities have existed, but we are starting to see now towards the end of the year what that is looking like in terms of new structures, people who are being affected by those restructures, some consolidation of different teams, largely on the back office functions at the moment. We probably will be hearing more about what the impacts are on the research areas once we know more about the science investment priorities that are due to be announced.
And that brings me to another major change this year, which was there was changes in the budget around funding. There was subsequent further changes to funding. And then there was an announcement about a new research funding system. Can you give us a brief summary of that new way of funding science research that the government has announced?
Right. So this was one of the key recommendations coming out of that Science System Advisory Group report. And it is basically pointing out that there is a very complex current system, lots of different separate organizations that are focused on different aspects of funding research in New Zealand. The major change that's happening is that nearly all of that work will be moving into and administered by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, or MB. They will be the secretariat for a new organization called Research Funding New Zealand. It'll take over the functions that we previously saw from the Marsden Fund Council, from the Endeavour Fund, and then eventually as well the Health Research Council. So we moved from a very complicated wiring diagram to one that looks quite straightforward with some simple pillars and all of the different functions supposedly still happening, but under a single research funding advisory board, 8 people who will have a lot of decision-making power for where research funding goes.
That is a long list of changes some of which are still ongoing. So as we come to the end of 2025, what is still on that to-do list for 2026 in terms of the science sector reform?
So one of the key things is we're still waiting to hear the advice that we're expecting to come back from the Prime Minister's new advisory council. This is something that has been tasked. It's a new group established this year. They are looking at the priorities for research across the entire reformed science system, and they will be announcing what their advice is. It will feed into a new investment plan for science. So, it will be quite significant because the way that the new Research Funding New Zealand body has been set up is that it will follow what those investment plan priorities are, and that will have impacts that flow on through the rest of the research system. We're also waiting to hear about what the Advanced Technology Institute, what that will look like, the rest of the areas it's going to focus on. They will be announcing new artificial intelligence platforms, which will be focal points for research on AI. A lot of expectations, high hopes for what that is going to look like, and we'll get more details in 2026.
So as we come to the end of the year, Daisha, there's been so many different changes. What is the mood on the ground amongst the scientists that you're talking to?
Well, we've gathered reactions to each of these announcements as they've come out through the year. And I would say that, there's definitely a desire to maintain a cautious optimism and to be as positive as possible. But it has been very relentless. And we're hearing things like this degree of change without any increase in resourcing is a real difficult challenge for the sector. We've had quotes from the chair of the Independent Research Organization saying things like strategic planning without resourcing is not a plan, it's a wish list. And characterizing this year's budget for science as being essentially starvation rations. So I would say that there is a lot of concern for how these changes are going to filter down to a loss of really important people and capability within the research sector as people get absolutely fed up and decide to take their opportunities elsewhere. So hopeful that we can get through this with a stronger science system, but still a lot of concern for exactly what it's going to look like when all this change is finally visible and impacting everyday research.
And look, that's not all. There's also been progress on a gene technology bill, which National campaigned on, and that looks to replace New Zealand's existing stringent genetic modification laws with a new regulatory system. However, that has stalled in the last few months due to coalition party opposition to certain aspects of the bill. Alongside keeping an eye on the science sector reforms, the team at the Science Media Centre have also got their finger on the pulse of happenings in the science world. They sift through published science papers to find ones with New Zealand connections that they put in a daily newsletter, and they get expert reactions to breaking news that they share with journalists. I asked media advisor Daniel Walker what was one of the big science stories that stood out for him across this year.
Every year we put together a list of the top 10 science stories for us. Probably thinking the top one that we have here of our list at least was some massive de-extinction news that we had coming through this year. So these announcements that US startup Colossal Biosciences, valued at around $10 billion, made these very splashy media announcements involving celebrities, fluffy pups and Game of Thrones references, all announcing that they had actually successfully brought back the extinct American dire wolf. When we ended up speaking to experts here in Aotearoa, some of the things that they started saying was, if it sounds too good to be true, it likely is. As more details came to light, researchers said it'd be more accurate to call them a GMO grey wolf or a hybrid animal. And so there was a lot of debate around what does de-extinction actually mean and what does this mean for our endangered species?
And that debate came very close to home then later on in the year, right?
Absolutely. So they did not stop at dire wolves. They announced that they want to do the same thing for a range of different species, including the South Island giant moa. Expert eyebrows raised a little higher when they said that they were going to do this for the moa. With a wolf, it's possible to go and change and tweak a few genes, but it's a lot harder with a bird. It has to hatch from an egg, so it's a much trickier process. And the amount of time that our species here in Aotearoa diverged from similar species is a long time ago. So the surrogate species that they'd be using would be a South American tinamo, which is a much smaller creature, and potentially incubating it into an emu. Again, this is all the theory here. This has not actually practically been done, and a lot of scientists kind of saying, it may not even be possible to be done. Regardless, if it is done, what happens when that creature hatches and is walking around? What makes it a moa? What teaches it to act and behave like a moa? So lots and lots of very open questions around this.
Yeah, so a lot of fanfare, a lot of debate when that announcement was made, but as you say, we'll have to wait and see how they get on, and there's still a lot of questions to be answered. What was next on your list?
Yeah, so here we have a couple of highs and lows in space news. So starting with the low, the investment that New Zealand made into a satellite called MethaneSat. We ended up, unfortunately, losing that up in the atmosphere this year. So we poured this money in, hoping that we'd be able to track agricultural greenhouse gas emissions at some point in the future. The satellite's initial purpose is to actually look at these oil and gas pipelines and figure out where the leaks are coming from, how much these oil and gas companies are actually leaking extra methane into the atmosphere and keeping them as honest as possible. But yeah, unfortunately, in June it lost contact with the ground. The month before that, the increased solar activity had been sending it into safe mode, but then unfortunately, totally lost contact with it.
Yeah, my colleague Ellen Rikers did a story on poor old MethaneSat lost to space. My understanding is that some New Zealand scientists are hoping that they'll still be able to get something out of the data, but as you say, an unfortunate loss because the New Zealand government did commit quite a significant number of millions towards the project. But you said lows and highs. Have you got a space high for us?
Yeah, so if you can see them, I recommend you go and take a look at the pictures that came out of this brand new telescope called the Vera C. Rubin Observatory. Inside this observatory is the world's largest camera. There's some glorious pictures that have come out of this. Most space telescopes, Hubble, James Webb, they're meant to look deep into space at a small patch of sky. The Vera C. Rubin Observatory does the opposite. It's trying to look as wide as possible, and over a long time scale, it's going to eventually, hopefully, detect most of the tiny rocks in the solar system and potentially help us understand how quickly the universe is expanding. And specifically, researchers here in Aotearoa are excited because this telescope is based in Chile, and as the world turns around, that means New Zealand has the next follow-up telescopes in the world. So if Vera C. Rubin spots anything, a supernova exploding, a particularly interesting piece of space rock that we want to take a look at, we'll be the first in the world to have an opportunity to follow up on it.
Wow, that's cool. Okay, I will definitely go and have a look at those pictures. Looking ahead to 2026 then, what's kind of on your radar? What, in terms of big science stories, what kind of things are you looking out for? I mean, I presume things like AI and climate change, they're not going away.
Absolutely. Climate change is not going away. We saw a trend this year of some scale back greenhouse gas emissions policies and a focus as well from a massive conference here on climate adaptation. One of the things that came out of that was this idea of cascading climate risks. So like a domino effect where you have one hazard flowing through to others. So a road is taken out, but that flows on to something like emergency services. They can't go along that road, reach the town to help people. Farmers might not be able to move their stock. Power lines, water pipes could be taken out along that road too. So you have these kind of risks that flow on from each other, and it's not just the one thing that goes, but the rest of them. And of course, as we see the increased storms and hazards, heat waves, etc., that come through from climate change, we're going to see an increased focus on those cascading risks. Where can we make the most bang for our buck, basically? Where can we put some investment that's not just going to solve one problem, but solve many problems that might trickle down from that?
This, I think, is going to be the year where some of the hype around artificial intelligence starts to cross over into really tangible impacts on people's lives. We've seen just in October this year, the first international scientific conference that was entirely run and organized and judged by artificial intelligence agents set up for that purpose. All of the papers were entirely conceived, written, and produced by AI. This came out of Stanford, and it was something that was basically looking at, look, we know that AI is being used in the background for a lot of the work that goes into doing research. What if we just completely take this out of the shadows, we put it front and center, and we push it as hard as we can to see what breaks? We are going to see more in terms of how artificial intelligence is applied to biology as well. So on the cutting edges of synthetic biology, working out which kinds of genetic editing is going to happen. This is stuff that's happening already in labs around the world. We're seeing a move out of the theoretical and into the tangible, practical, equally in things like 3D printing and the wider picture for how this is going to start creating objects, right? And working out which new materials are going to be possible to solve challenges like solar cells, right? These are all areas where we can see that rapid advancement in AI will likely start to be visible in the outcomes of science research in 2026.
Anything else on your list that you think is going to pop up on 2026?
Yeah, well, we have a fascinating event coming up in May 2026 in Las Vegas. It's called the Enhanced Games. It's meant to be a competitor to the Olympics, basically without any restrictions on what kinds of performance-enhancing drugs, steroids, that athletes can take. The Enhanced Games creator was on RNZ not long ago, and he was talking about the project. He was mentioning a lot of the scientific evidence. Said it shows that anabolic steroids are safer for individuals in society than alcohol, cannabis, tobacco. But there's going to be big questions on how this event is actually run and what this means for the athletes involved. We've heard from other experts saying that, there's limited evidence actually around these drugs, and especially the way that some users use them, combining multiple performance-enhancing drugs being a common practice. We just don't have a whole lot of information on what that does to people's bodies. There's also a fascinating part that's coming out recently that they didn't say when they first launched this, that they are actually offering their own consumer health products, which are basically also their own performance-enhancing drugs that they're going to sell to be able to make some money to help fund this event. So we're going to be keeping an eye on that, and hopefully talking to some experts to get a clearer picture of, what does the science actually say in this area.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting event for sure. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and best of luck in the year 2026.
Thanks so much, Claire.
Thanks, Claire.
Thanks to Daisha Herbilock and Daniel Walker of the Science Media Centre. This episode was produced by me, Claire Kincannon, and sound engineering was by Mark Chesterman. Script editing was by Liz Garton. Te nā koe I whakarongo mai. Thank you so much for listening to this episode and all year round. I'm Claire Kincannon. I'll be on a summer break for the next few weeks, but keep listening here for some science-related stories from my RNZ podcast colleagues. And remember, find and follow the Kākāpō Files too. Mā te wā.